G'day, Richard here. As you may know, we're back and we're making new podcasts. But with work commitments, we may not finish a new podcast every week. So we're planning to handpick some of our favourite podcast episodes from our back catalogue and republish them with updated commentary of why we liked each episode and what has changed about the subject since the podcast originally aired. The evidence base supporting a low-carb ketogenic dietary intervention for type 2 diabetics to treat their disease only grows every day. In 2014, when I started keto, there was just a handful of robust studies that strongly suggested this approach would work to treat type 2 diabetics and that it would be safe to do so, especially with respect to the concerns of a diet that is really quite high in saturated fat and how that would impact biomarkers of heart disease. I think back then we just had really the work of Eric Westman showing that, surprisingly, heart disease biomarkers like Ldl Cholesterol, the good kind, increased, and importantly, triglycerides in circulation decreased. Now, in 2021, we have a positive cornucopia of studies from the long-term open-labelled controlled clinical trial of Sarah Hallberg showing that type 2 diabetics treated with a ketogenic diet versus usual care are significantly able to reduce their anti-glycemic medications and significantly improve their glucose control to the point that they would no longer be considered type 2 diabetics. Another example is a Pure study of Salim Youssef looking at correlations in 18 countries of 135,000 subjects showing that high carbohydrate intake was associated with higher risk of total mortality, whereas total fat and individual types of fat were related to lower total mortality. Total fat and types of fat were also not associated with cardiovascular disease, myocardial infarction, or cardiovascular disease mortality, whereas saturated fat surprisingly had an inverse association with stroke. More saturated fat, less stroke. But one of the most interesting studies for me over the past 7 years has been the study by Kara Eberling and David Ludwig in 2020. This one is called Energy Requirement is Higher During Weight Loss Maintenance in Adults Consuming a Low Compared with a High Carbohydrate Diet. This study was a feeding study completed in Framingham, Massachusetts, where subjects with a BMI over 25, so they're obese, and they've lost on average 10.5% of their body weight before the study, were randomly assigned to a low, moderate and high carbohydrate dietary maintenance arm for 20 weeks, with a caloric content controlled to maintain their body weight loss. And their total energy expenditure was measured. That's what was being measured in the study. Now, none of these were ketogenic amounts of carbs. The low carb group was 20% of energy from carbs, the moderate group 40% and the high group 60%, and protein was locked in at 20% with fat making up the rest. The goal was to see, after weight loss, which diet was easier to maintain. It turns out that the amount of energy used, or the calories out, in the low-carb arm was 2,565, which was significantly higher than the moderate carb arm at 2,447, which was significantly higher than the high-carb arm at 2,289. That's around 276 more kilocalories burned every day if you were on a 20% carb diet than if you were on a 60% carb diet. For every 10% decrease in carbohydrates, there was a 50 kilocalorie per day increase in energy use. Now, you may remember last week in Bullshit, I spoke about the biochemistry of how insulin inhibits fatty acid oxidation and results in the diversion of fuel to make new fat. That predicts pretty much what this study showed, that as you increase carbs in the diet, you increase insulin secreted, and that increasingly diverts fuel from being turned into energy into making new fat. This is the face washer in the bathtub drain in action. Anyway, this episode that I've selected for my review is an interview that I had with the primary investigator of that study, Dr. David Ludwig, in 2017. This is well before this study was done. This was also my first solo interview, and you'll hear that my interview technique is a bit rough. Sorry about that. Anyway, Dr. Ludwig does not directly study ketogenic diets. Well, you'll hear that in this interview. He has a more balanced approach for general nutrition, lower carb, slower carbs like beans rather than grains, but he believes that a low carbohydrate diet is appropriate for treating type 2 diabetics. And I agree with him on that. Anyway, so enjoy this Two Keto Dudes handpicked review of Always Hungry with Dr. David Ludwig.
Welcome back to Two Keto Dudes. This is Carl Franklin from Connecticut in the United States. And in February 2016, I put myself on a ketogenic diet to take control of my metabolism. In just 2.5 months, I managed to reverse all my markers of type 2 diabetes with diet alone. As of now, I'm about 80 pounds lighter with no signs of diabetes or heart disease.
Hi, I'm Richard Morris in Canberra, Australia. I've been on a ketogenic diet since April of 2014. And when I started, I was very sick with complications from type 2 diabetes. Within 6 months of starting a ketogenic diet, all of my biomarkers of disease had disappeared. I've lost about 100 pounds and I've completely turned my health around.
And this show is a document of my progress through ketosis and Richard's experience thriving for years in ketosis.
Yes, sir.
And hopefully that might help a few people who are curious about this kind of dietary hacking.
Yeah, we're not doctors. We don't want to give anyone any medical advice, but we are keen to share our own experiences. We're actually both software developers, so we're not afraid of a little technical detail, are we, Carl?
Nope.
We've done some research into our own deranged metabolisms and the science behind them. We hope to share some of that research. Where possible, we intend to put links in the show notes to cite research supporting any claims that we make.
And you'll probably work out pretty quickly that we're both foodies.
Oh, yeah.
We love to cook and we love to eat.
Sure do.
In every episode, we both share a keto recipe that cannot be ignored.
It cannot.
Yeah. All right, Richard, let's start podcast number 94, Always Hungry, with Dr. David Ludwig.
Heard you say you're due for a little.
So, Richard, do we have any apologies or corrections from last week's show with Asim Malhotra?
No, that was, Asim was pretty good. I don't think we have had anyone complain about anything that he said.
No, that's very true.
Yeah.
That's great. All right, well, let's revisit what a ketogenic diet is.
Sure. It's 20 grams or less of carbohydrate per day, moderate protein. So for us, it's between 1 and 1.5 grams per kilogram of lean mass of protein. And we get all of our energy from fat.
Fat.
That's fat on your plate or fat on that Krispy Kreme that you ate a decade ago.
Well, Richard, how was your week?
Yeah, it was pretty good. I actually hit the lowest weight point that I have been since I was 22. So when I was 22, I was 102 kilograms. And the other day after, I've been doing this 3-day fast sort of every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, every week.
Yeah.
The other day at the end of my Wednesday 3-day fast and at the end of a quick 12K bike ride, my body weight, now admittedly I was slightly dehydrated, but my body weight was 101.8 kilograms. So,
wow.
Yeah, lowest ever. Booyah.
Well done, sir.
Well, thank you. So I don't consider it to be my actual weight because obviously I was dehydrated and I had no food in me because, I'd not been eating for 3 days.
Hey, how do you know you weren't dehydrated when you weighed yourself at 22?
Could have been, but I'm gonna say that I was, around about 104 kilograms, and that extra weight loss was just, transitory. But I'm looking at my rolling average of weights over the past 2 or 3 months, and every month I'm dropping an average of 0.6 of a kilogram. So
that's great.
I'm getting slowly lighter over time as I'm going. I'm just keeping calm and ketoing on.
I think that's great.
So that seems to be working for me. Yeah. The other thing that happened to me this week is I watched a lot of cricket because it's the Ashes is on, and I watched a bit of rugby league last night. The World Cup final was on, and Australia beat England in the World Cup final of rugby league, which I'm very happy about. And then we beat them in Brisbane in the Ashes, and the match currently in South Australia is pretty even. So we've got like 5 matches to play out over 2 months, and it's a long, involved sporting event. But it's very popular in both Australia and England. So that's what I've been doing this week. Yeah. So how was your week, Carl?
My week was really, really great. I went to Italy on vacation.
Wow.
If you listen to the Obesity Code podcast, you'll know that we didn't do one last week because I was on vacation. Mm-hmm. The story is my daughter, Emmy, who's been on the show, on the first Newbies show.
Yeah, she was our first guest.
She was. She got a job being an au pair for a family right outside of Florence in the Tuscany area.
Oh, nice. Nice part of Italy.
Ponte in a little town called Rufina. And she was at the end of her term, Mm-hmm. And so I went to spend 5 or 6 days with her right after Thanksgiving and see Florence and see the town and see a couple more towns. We went to Siena, for example, and then come home with her. But I want to pay particular attention to the people that I met there, the wonderful people. First of all, she was staying with a family and taking care of a baby. They both work for the Antinori Vineyard, which is the biggest winemaker in Tuscany.
Nice.
And they also have brands of wine all over the world. But I learned a lot about wine. But
Nice.
What I learned mostly was there's no obese people here.
Right.
And when I say none, the only obese people I could see were American tourists.
Wow.
And maybe some elderly gentlemen who have a little belly, but nothing like me, nothing like big, obese people. And then, I looked at what they ate, and in the morning they don't eat a lot, but what they do eat is, coffee or, espresso, pastry, and fruit.
Yeah. Yep.
In the morning.
That's very common in France as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're not slathering olive oil on it, or they don't eat anything. And then, a light lunch of some cold cut, some cheese. It's usually very ketogenic, except for they have fresh bread with everything.
Yeah.
A lot of olive oil. And then dinners are just dinners. I mean, there's salads, there's oil everywhere. Oh, they put olive oil on everything. There's no butter anywhere. It's all olive oil. Wow. And they throw olive oil on everything, and everything is well salted and lots of, fatty proteins and it's just astonishing to me that, they maintain this lifestyle, which also is very active. They walk around a lot. The terrain is hilly and it's beautiful outdoors. And why wouldn't you want to be outdoors all the time kind of thing? Right. But it's just astonishing to me that they don't have the problems that we have. And frankly, I don't think they ever had. Yeah. When I said I was a type 2 diabetic and couldn't eat bread, they look at me like I'm strange, like I'm from a different planet. Like I've never seen deranged metabolisms like this before. Right. So it was just very curious to me. And I immediately came home and started a fast. So, and it's not because, not because I cheated or anything. I didn't do that, but I just wanted to, after eating all this wonderful food, it's a good time to fast. Yeah. And I decided olive oil is going to be my new thing. So what I'm doing on my fast is, I'm taking salt. That's fine. But if I ever feel like I need something more than salt and water, I'm doing a shot of olive oil with some truffle salt in it. Yeah.
Just make sure you have good olive oil. That's the thing.
Now, I'm glad you brought that up because I remember seeing an article online, and you probably have too, that some 69% of all olive oil is made with canola or soy or some fake oil, right? So I actually went to Snopes.com and looked at, what they said about it. And they said that it's half right. Okay. So what's true is that testing carried out in 2008 and 2010 reported that some popular olive oil brands didn't meet the criteria to be labeled as extra virgin olive oil, even though they were.
So they were heat processed.
Yeah. But what's false is that tests didn't show that 69% of the olive oil sold in the U.S. is made wholly or primarily from something other than olives.
Interesting. I know that a lot of the Spanish olive oil that we get in Australia is the rancid stuff that they can't sell in their own local market. And
that may be true, yeah.
Yeah, so olive oil in Australia, it's generally advisable to go after local olives. So there's fairly large olive oil production around the Mildura region and along the Murray River. And so I generally try to buy local Australian extra virgin olive oil, and generally you can taste it. I mean, if you're gonna taste just neat olive oil, you're gonna quickly work out if it's gone rancid or not. So
yes, you will.
Yeah, that's the idea. Yep. I mean, olive oil shouldn't taste nasty. It should taste fruity of the olives.
It should. And I also learned, because the family that Emmy stayed with had an olive grove and a vineyard, just a family vineyard, with a few acres and the top of the hill kind of thing on a villa. Yeah, it was terrible. I know. It was just bad. but she learned what makes olive oil bitter and green, and it's the leaves.
The tannins,
so when they press the olives, if there are leaves in it, those leaves give it the bitter taste and the green look. But if it's just pure olives, it'll be mostly yellow.
Nice.
And so some people like that spicy note, the pepper that you get from the leaves being crushed in there. But I'm with you. I buy Californian olive oil, and that's what I use. Yeah. And it turns out that it's, made from olives and not canola or soy. So,
outstanding.
Yeah, thanks, Snopes. So that was my week, Richard.
So I think we should find someone from our fan club to give some loot to.
Yeah, that's right. We should. And we're giving away Keep Calm and Keto on mugs with our mugs on them.
Awesome. Yeah.
You could put your coffee or your olive oil or whatever else you want to put in there.
And how do you get in the competition to win one of those?
You go to fanclub.2keto.com and answer a few questions, and you're in.
Nice.
And so we pick a winner every show at random, and today's winner is Max Lewis.
Congratulations, Max. Well done.
Congratulations, yes. And Max will be sending that out to you as soon as we get your mailing address, and congrats.
Yeah, of course, if you don't want to wait to win a mug, you can't wait for the lottery, then you can always buy one at gear.2keto.com. And you can pick yourself up a T-shirt while you're there.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that brings us to a little segment we call...
We're going to stop doing that. We're going to come up with a new bit.
I don't think so.
So what have you got, Carl?
Well, as many listeners know, we have started more podcasts, and one of them is the Obesity Code podcast with Jason and Megan.
Yep.
And we did a Thanksgiving special a couple weeks ago now. And this was particularly not just about Thanksgiving, but the holidays in general. And I want to give you the question which came from our ketogenic forums, which you can get to at forum.2keto.com. The question is, how to survive Christmas when your family is not supporting your diet. And I think you could easily substitute holidays for Christmas. If you don't celebrate Christmas, I mean, the end of the year, we all get together and eat, right? With our family.
Another way to ask this is how to survive being around your family when they disagree with your diet.
Yeah, that's right. And so, the question is that, but I'll just read it. This person says, "Hey, guys, I'll be on a trip with my family-in-law during 2 weeks, Christmas and New Year's Eve celebration, and I don't know how to survive. They are French and pretty food-loving people, lots of wine, too. They have been making fun of my weird diet, last year when I was doing intermittent fasting to lower my cholesterol, too much triglycerides."
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, we think the opposite happens, but that's okay. But this year I've started keto, and I really like to see progress with my percentage of body fat and cholesterol. But since I can't make them cook keto, I know I'll be eating carb during 2 weeks in order to be polite and lessen the potential frictions in the family. Do you have experience with similar situations, and how hard is it to be on keto afterwards? How hard is it to get back on track? So, you can chime in, Richard, but I will say this. First of all, there is no need to eat carbs when you're with your family as long as there are good sources of fatty protein.
Sure.
All right?
Yeah.
But Megan, and the reason I brought up the Obesity Code podcast is because Megan gave a really, really great tip to everybody, and I think we should all heed it, which is before dinner, about an hour before dinner, load up on your keto food, olives, fatty proteins, bacon, cheese, whatever it is that you're going to eat, so that by the time you sit down to eat, you're not tempted by carbohydrates. And you can have a serving of whatever fatty proteins, vegetables are on the table and eat those. And if at the end of that, you can't, you have to have a piece of bread or whatever, yeah, okay. Don't beat yourself up about it. But chances are you're going to be able to resist it because you're not hungry when you sit down at the table with all this stuff. Megan Ramos, genius.
Yeah. No, that was wonderful advice. It really was.
So what do you think, Richard? How would you tell somebody how to survive a meal like that?
Okay, so what I'd do is I would say load up on vegetables and slather them with olive oil or with butter. I would eat the salad, probably keep the dressing on the side unless I knew what was in it. Probably just ask for just straight olive oil as a dressing. And if somebody loads up my plate with potatoes and rice and bread, I'd probably suggest to them that go ahead and load it up. I probably won't be eating much of that, though, because I'm not that hungry.
Right.
You know, but really, sometimes your family will try and get you to eat carbs because it's a funny thing to do. So,
it's weird, huh?
It is. It's strange. It's a little bit self-destructive. But as Megan said, you know, if you're firm with them and you explain to them the issue, they might be a little bit upset initially, but when they realize that you're looking after you and you're looking after your health, they'll probably come around. So, so my advice is go listen to the Thanksgiving episode for the Obesity Code podcast because Megan's got some great tips.
Agree. So you got a mail, Richard?
I do. I've got one, and this is from Steve Stevenson, and he says, this is a post that was in the Ketogenic forum, and his post's title is "Cancer in a Remission."
Oh,
and
yeah.
He says, my oncologist's analysis of my PET bone scan yesterday says I'm in full remission, and he says it's remarkable given that it was high volume metastatic prostate cancer. He says all blood tests are normal, a little anemic, which is usual for me since I'm undergoing radiation therapy. And the prostate specific antibodies is 0.1, which means that the cancer's not diagnosable anymore. And Steve says, I told him my theory that my very low insulin levels caused by my diet and Megan Ramos's intermittent fasting helped me greatly, insulin being a growth hormone. He said metformin, a drug used by diabetics to lower insulin, seems to help treat cancer, and there's some confirmation of that theory. In any event, he said to keep doing whatever it is I'm doing, and including all the exercise, which he thinks is very positive for cancer. Plus, he's an amateur triathlete, so he would say that, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
Steve also says, by the way, I've been following Amber's lead in eating a ketogenic Paleolithic carnivore diet for the last 6 to 9 months. I love rare ribeye, grass-fed and finished beef, smoked wild sockeye salmon and prosciutto. I do use coconut milk and oil in my coffee and olive oil on my canned wild sardines. So that's one heck of a victory lap. Well done, Steve. And
well done, Steve.
Thank you for letting us know. That is outstanding.
You know, Steve came to Keto Fest.
Right.
2017.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing him at the house and just brimming, grinning ear to ear, just a happy man. And I had no idea that he had prostate cancer. And I do remember talking to him and he was very appreciative of what we were doing and as a big fan. So Steve, thumbs up to you, man.
Yeah. Well done,
Keep
buddy.
calm and keto on. Well done.
Yeah.
So Richard, this is your interview that you ran into David Ludwig in Sydney, right?
Yeah, funny story, I was just in America. You and I were in Boston. We were on our way to see Jason Fung in Toronto. And we contacted Dr. Ludwig because he is a Harvard professor and he works at Boston Children's Hospital, and he's a pediatric endocrinologist. And we were going to have a chat to him about he's written a book called Always Hungry, but he's also doing presentations on the science of low carb. And so we wanted to speak to him while we're in Boston, and we were traveling through. We went to Framingham and we went up to Boston, and it turned out that he was actually in Australia because he was on sabbatical. So we contacted his people and said, look, I'm going to be back in Australia in a week's time. Let's tee up a time. And we managed to do that. I went to a lecture of his at Sydney University, thanks to Jenny Brand Miller, who set that up. And then after the lecture, we spoke about his work.
Great. Well, before we play the recording, let me just give you his bio, listener.
Yeah, sure.
David S. Ludwig, MD, PhD, is an endocrinologist and researcher at Boston's Children's Hospital, as Richard said. He holds the rank of Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and Professor of Nutrition at Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. Ludwig is founder of the Optimal Weight for Life, or OWL program at Children's Hospital, one of the country's oldest and largest multidisciplinary clinics for the care of overweight children. His research focuses on the effects of diet on hormones, metabolism, and body weight. In particular, he developed a novel low glycemic load diet, or in other words, one lowers blood sugar and insulin after meals, for the treatment of obesity and prevention of type 2 diabetes and heart disease. Described as an obesity warrior by Time magazine, Dr. Ludwig has fought for fundamental policy changes to improve the food environment. And there you go. So I'm really interested to hear this conversation. Let's just roll the recording.
Okay, so I'm here with Dr. Professor David Ludwig. Would you prefer doctor or professor? David?
Either way.
You've been in Australia now for, what, a couple of weeks?
Yes. Came out at the beginning of November for a mini sabbatical.
Mini sabbatical. It's a nice place to have a sabbatical, actually,
lovely
Sydney.
place, especially at this time of year.
Yeah. So I don't know if you've noticed in Australia, we tend to shorten everything, like breakfast. The word breakfast becomes brekkie.
Uh-huh.
Afternoon becomes arvo, and names get shortened. So has anyone called you Davo yet?
Not yet, and
Okay.
I hope to escape that fate.
Right, okay. You've been in Australia now for 2 weeks, and you're here on a sabbatical. You just did a presentation yesterday. This was actually on World Diabetes Day, wasn't it?
That's right. A presentation for the Charles Perkins Center, public lecture.
And I was lucky enough to be able to attend that, and it was a recitation of some of the evidence basis behind a low-carb diet. So one of the things that you said that I think was probably a little bit controversial is that you said that diabetics, type 2 diabetics, probably should all be on a low-carb diet, which I think might be seen as controversial for the peak bodies responsible for dealing with both diabetics and diet in Australia. I know that the Dietitians Association, their standard, or in fact the Australian Dietary Guidelines, are between 45 and 55% of your calories per day from carbohydrate, which is you can't fit a low-carb diet into that scenario. And Diabetes Australia cede to the Australian Dietary Guidelines, which is set up by the dietitians. So really, I know when I was first diagnosed with diabetes, my HbA1c was 11.2, and I was given a diet that was 300 grams a day of carbohydrate. What do you think about that as a strategy for treating a diabetic?
Well, 100 years ago, before insulin was available for clinical use, the treatment for diabetes was fairly consistently a low carbohydrate diet. In fact, a very low carbohydrate diet was life prolonging in type 1 or juvenile diabetes.
Really?
This was state of the art. Children could be kept alive in some cases for years with an ultra low, or what we now call a ketogenic, low carbohydrate diet. With the discovery of insulin, people could eat more carbohydrate and control the surge of blood sugar by adjusting the insulin dose.
Right.
Over the years, as a consequence, the recommendations for carbohydrate greatly liberalized until the 1980s and 1990s, when fat was considered universally unhealthy as a nutrient. Led to recommendations for all people, including diabetes, of a very high carbohydrate diet, up to 60% of calories as carbohydrate or more. In fact, the classic American Diabetes Association recommendations during that time was 60-20-20, 60% carbohydrate, 20% protein, 20% fat.
Right.
Now, since then, recommendations have continued to change to varying degrees among professional organizations around the world, so that the American Diabetes Association now doesn't have one specific nutrient target and encourages individualization. But as a starting point, on their website to this day, suggest aiming for 45 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per meal.
Wow.
As a starting point.
Yeah.
So, yes, we can, to a considerable degree, control the surge of blood sugar that occurs with a high carbohydrate meal using insulin. But high doses of insulin itself has downsides.
Sure.
One is hypoglycemia in the late postprandial period. So if we keep blood sugar from surging too high immediately after a meal, which we know can produce damaging effects on blood vessels and metabolism, we set ourselves up for hypoglycemia,
right.
the opposite problem 3 or 4 hours later.
Yeah.
In addition, continuously high doses of insulin may itself be an important cardiovascular risk factor.
Right.
Hyperinsulinemia can promote insulin resistance, just as insulin resistance can promote hyperinsulinemia in someone without diabetes.
Yeah.
High doses of insulin have metabolic effects throughout the body, the constellation of which can be described as the metabolic syndrome, the insulin resistance syndrome of high triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, chronic inflammation, high blood pressure.
Central adiposity,
coagulation defects.
Coagulation defects.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Part of the metabolic syndrome.
That's interesting. And the reason I say that, I recently got a DNA test. I'm type 2 diabetic, as you know, and recovering type 2 diabetic. And I have Leiden factor 5, which is a coagulation defect, which causes me a chance of venous clots.
Yeah. Some coagulation problems can be genetic, so inborn, and
which would be my case, yeah.
But the coagulopathy that is associated with the metabolic syndrome involves an increased tendency to form blood clots.
Okay.
So hypercoagulability.
Right.
Fibrinogen goes up.
Yeah.
Pi1 also changes. These relate to how quickly the body will form a clot and how quickly clots in the wrong places can get appropriately dealt with by fibrinolysis, so the process of breaking down clots. Clotting is one of the final events in a heart attack or a stroke.
Oh, right, yes.
So, clotting in the blood vessel is a bad thing.
Yeah.
So the tendency to develop atheromas, so fatty deposits that then become inflamed, chronic inflammation, and coagulopathy, is a recipe for cardiovascular disease.
Okay.
So yes, we can with modern insulin analogs, which drug companies have spent billions of dollars developing, do a better job of controlling blood sugar on a high carbohydrate diet compared to where we were 50 or certainly 100 years ago.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that a high carbohydrate diet is necessarily, desirable. And conceptually speaking, reducing carbohydrate in the diet makes the challenge of controlling blood sugar, both that initial surge at 1 hour and the potential crash at 3 or 4 hours, makes both of those easier because you're not hitting such a quickly moving target.
Right.
Now, the ultimate extreme is a very low or a carbohydrate or a ketogenic diet with so little carbohydrate that one experiences essentially no changes in blood sugar after a meal.
Right.
And so that conceptually makes management of diabetes much easier because then you just need basal doses for most of one's requirements, and then very small amounts with meals predominantly focused on the protein content.
Right.
Protein does require some. But protein is digested more slowly and has a much gentler impact on blood sugar.
Right.
So these very low carbohydrate diets are now being used by tens or hundreds of thousands of people in the United States with type 2 diabetes, but increasingly type 1 diabetes as well. We really need good studies. My research group has done and is doing studies of very low carbohydrate diets in small controlled settings, but we also need funding. The research, the world of nutrition research needs much more significant funding to conduct the definitive clinical trials.
Yeah.
If a drug company has a promising new drug, they snap their fingers and can raise hundreds of millions of dollars to do a phase 3 clinical trial. And that's a drug to treat perhaps just one complication of our poor diet or of diabetes, such as hypertension or high cholesterol or clotting defects.
Sure.
Why must nutrition research beg for, just paltry sums? We need to conduct high-quality clinical trials that cost tens or even $100 million to get definitive answers. This would be a no-brainer in pharmacological research, but yet, because nobody benefits to the same degree, nutrition research is a poor stepchild. And in fact, you could argue there's a vested interest in not having more effective nutritional approaches to diabetes or heart disease, because it would put a lot of drug companies out of business.
Yeah.
For $100 million, we could come up with a definitive answer to the question, does a very low carbohydrate diet, is it definitively advantageous for type 1 and for type 2 diabetes compared to a standard high carbohydrate diet?
Right.
Or could you accomplish much of the benefit with a moderate carbohydrate diet? Maybe just bringing total carbohydrate down to 25%. So that's enough so that people can still have a really widely variable and diverse diet with whole fruits, vegetables, some beans, even maybe small amounts of whole kernel grain products.
Sure.
Maybe one doesn't need to go to that extreme of a ketogenic diet. We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't have the trials, but we can come up with answers, and likely there's going to be some individual variation. There'll be some people who require more extreme approaches, others who can get by with a little more flexibility.
Yeah.
How do we predict those people?
Yeah.
Well, we can.
Right.
If we had the right research, and it's time that it be done.
So I understand that you're working with Dr. Richard Bernstein on some type 1 diabetics in a study to see how their glucose is maintained on a almost ketogenic diet.
Right. We have a preliminary data on a community of individuals, both children and adults.
Okay.
Interestingly,
Nice.
about half of them are children,
Wow.
consuming a very low carbohydrate diet. It's not specifically ketogenic. And in fact, many people in this community are consuming relatively high amounts of protein, which would tend to have a suppressive effect on ketones. But in any event, total carbohydrate intake is very low.
Yeah.
So this is an approach which was specifically discouraged in recent years by the major diabetes associations. Again, even though 100 years ago, this kind of a diet would have been life-preserving for people with type 1 diabetes.
So that's crying out for research then to test that assumption.
So we have some preliminary data. In fact, we've submitted it for publication. It's not a clinical trial. This is an observational study, but an observational study is the place to start.
That's right.
So if you want to document a phenomenon that's thought not to be possible, then an observational study is the right first approach. And then hopefully, once those data are published, we can use them to argue for the need for a high-quality randomized control trial.
Right.
But that's a big, to do a randomized control trial in type 1 diabetes with adequate power is a big deal. We want to do it right. We know that, unlike the general public, having diabetes, and especially type 1 diabetes, carries important risks. Someone shifting from a standard diet to a low carbohydrate diet without appropriately adjusting insulin dose and other management aspects could be at risk for severe hypoglycemia. So we have to get it. We have to do it right. And not all low carbohydrate diets are alike. How low do we need to go with carbohydrate?
Right.
How much protein? How do we distribute the calories through the day? How do you adjust insulin based on what you're eating and what your blood sugars are? These aren't, this is not rocket science, but it requires some careful attention to study design,
Right.
so that the results are rigorous.
Yes.
And the general nutrition and diabetes professional communities will recognize these data when they come as solid and informing of dietary guidelines.
Right. So we've actually had a conversation with Tim Noakes recently about a similar subject, and it's really, is the science going to be enough to change policy? And he has a view that he hopes it is, and he wishes it is, but he's a little bit, he is pessimistic, and Gary Taubes was the same. Gary Taubes said you can probably, it's going to be very difficult and very expensive to do the kind of study that will be incontrovertible.
Well, it's difficult and time consuming, but it's just a question of time. I'm optimistic that ultimately the truth will prevail. It won't necessarily prevail according to our time frame.
Right.
But the answers will come. The question is, can we, get the answers we need now to affect people's lives now, or is there going to be a delay of 5 or 10 or 15 years? I've been doing nutrition research for 20 years. I've seen evolution. Change does happen.
Okay.
I don't feel that anybody in the professional diabetes associations are intentionally trying to close down the process of science. They just have their view, and they're arguing that the data for some of these alternative approaches are not yet there.
Right.
And to a considerable degree, they're right.
Yeah.
We all can latch on to small studies that tend to support our ways of thinking.
Sure.
And I think, in my view, an objective analysis presently gives a strong advantage to low carbohydrate diets specifically for diabetes, but we don't have definitive data. Once we do, the paradigm will shift. And in fact, you'll go around and you'll find people who used to advocate, high carbohydrate diets who will enthusiastically embrace low carbohydrate diets and wonder with you why anybody ever thought differently. That's the nature of change.
We were always against sugar.
I think, but all it takes is, one billionaire to, be willing to put in, $50 or $100 million into a definitive clinical trial. That is a way that a person can have massive impact, and we're waiting at Harvard for those those dollars to flow. We'll get you the research.
Yeah. Well, potentially this could impact half of the world's population, because half of the world's population could well be capable of being type 2 diabetic.
Well, as of yesterday was World Diabetes Day, and new numbers came out, and there are presently an estimated 500 million people worldwide with diabetes. That's going to go up to, I think 750 or 800 million by the next decade.
Is that diagnosed diabetic?
Unfortunately, in many countries around the world, without state-of-the-art healthcare, and to some degree in the United States or Australia, cases of diabetes are unrecognized.
Right.
But even though, this is not a case of what you don't know won't hurt you.
Right, exactly.
The consequences of running chronically high blood sugars and the other metabolic dysfunction that occurs with diabetes, takes a big toll. And we're also seeing type 2 diabetes striking at younger and younger ages. It's one thing for a 50-year-old who'd been gaining excessive weight to develop type 2 diabetes, get the first heart attack at age 60 and maybe die at age 70.
Right.
It's a very different thing if the clock starts ticking at age 10.
Absolutely. And there are kids that young with type 2 diabetes,
yes.
right?
Yeah, in my clinical practice, I've seen dozens of children in early adolescence with frank type 2 diabetes, and that's a malignant condition.
Yeah.
That a diagnosis of diabetes at age 10 or 12, in terms of life expectancy, is probably worse, is as bad as, or might be worse than a diagnosis of standard risk leukemia.
Right. Wow. I was type 2 diabetic at 38, so I was very young when it happened to me. And I come from a medical family. My father's an anaesthetist, and his father was a old school physician. And when I said to him, I was living in Las Vegas at the time, I called and I said, yeah, I'm type 2 diabetic. He said, oh, yeah, that runs in the family. And I said, why didn't you tell me this? Why didn't I know that? We don't talk about these kinds of things. And what I didn't know, and I only learned recently, was my grandfather, I only knew that he died of a heart attack. He died at 70 of a heart attack. But I didn't know for the last 10 years of his life he was diabetic, and that wasn't even mentioned. So,
there's all other kinds of diabetes that run in families, something called MODY. Which is tends to be a dominant inheritance, and it's different kinds. They have a little different clinical implications than type 2.
Right.
So that's called maturity onset diabetes of the young. So for somebody who developed it at your age with 3 generations having diabetes, one could then think about this, and there are straightforward genetic tests to assess.
I have had a DNA test with 23andMe, and then taken the data and given it to Prometheus. Yeah, no, I think you
want to do this a little differently. Go, to any diabetologist could run the genes for MODY.
That's interesting. Yeah. So my father is not diabetic. So
it skipped one generation.
He passed an OGTT, but he is starting to be affected by Alzheimer's, and he's the only one in the family who's been affected.
Well, some people call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes, diabetes of the brain. Seriously.
Yeah.
And insulin resistance in the brain seems to be a critical mechanistic step in the development of Alzheimer's.
Right.
Which provides a theoretical basis for interest in ketogenic diets to manage or prevent Alzheimer's, because you can circumvent the insulin resistance with ketones to a considerable degree.
Right. So if the brain is having trouble fueling itself adequately via glucose, ketones provide an alternate substrate.
Yeah.
There was a woman whose husband had Alzheimer's who treated him with coconut oil. She was a pediatrician, and she treated him with coconut oil, and it became popular on YouTube, obviously, because anyone who has a member of the family with Alzheimer's is going to be attracted to that kind of story. But that was fascinating, and somebody who eats coconut oil is going to produce ketones
to varying degrees. If you're eating coconut oil, which contain medium chain triglycerides, and a lot of carbohydrate, you'll suppress the ketogenic drive.
Right.
So it's really a combination of reduced total carbohydrate, and especially the high glycemic index carbohydrates, with medium chain triglycerides, which then give you a strong ketogenic drive.
Right. So for somebody, say for a geriatric who it was difficult to put them onto a ketogenic diet because of compliance, and they just want to eat what they're used to eating all their lives, and maybe they're in an assisted care where the dietitian or nutritionist responsible for feeding them refuses to do that kind of thing. Is that probably a scenario where exogenous ketones might be appropriate, or is that?
Well, the question of exogenous ketones, so ketones not generated by the body, but taken as a drug, is a whole nother kettle of fish.
Yes.
Excuse the metaphor. One issue is the actual safety of the preparation. So we don't have a lot of data yet. Manufacturing techniques, contamination, and the like. A second issue is the pharmacodynamics. You're taking it, it's entering through the gut, being absorbed in different which is a biologically different route than making ketones itself in the liver. But a third issue is just dumping in a fuel into a body that's may already have an excess of another fuel, glucose.
Right. Sure.
So we typically make ketones when we primarily make ketones when glucose as a fuel runs low. So that's our alternative fuel.
That's the context in which we make.
That's how ketones would be made in the body in a state of low insulin and low glucose.
Right.
you take somebody on a standard high carbohydrate diet with high levels of glucose circulating and then dump in high levels of this alternative fuel, now you've created a state which would never exist in nature.
Right.
And we just don't know what you might feel good temporarily, but we don't know what the long-term consequences of that. You were jumping over a regulated biological step. And I always feel hesitant when we take that step, whether it's with a drug or with, other approaches like this that might, technically be diet, but, we're messing with biological pathways that,
right.
For which we just do not know the long-term consequences.
One of the concerns I've heard mentioned, and in fact I've mentioned multiple times, is the issue of the fact that ketones that we manufacture in labs, for the most part, are racemic, and so there's a stereoisomer, two stereoisomers. If you want a left-handed and right-handed version, we're used to we've got 3 billion years experience dealing with the right-handed version, and we've got 3 years experience dealing with the left-handed version, and possibly we've only tested it in mice in small amounts that we've tagged to see what happens, and some of it appears some of the carbon appears exhaled out. So there's it's being used for energy somehow, but we don't know how. We don't know what transports it's using. We don't know what enzymes are required. We know that the enzymes necessary to use the right-handed version chiral, and so they can only use the right-handed. And so there's this potential of dumping in half of the exogenous ketones could be stuff that we don't know what's happening, and what happens to a caloric amount of that over a long human lifetime. Give this to 30-year-old fit people who just want to feel slightly smarter for the moment, and what's 30, 40 years of that going to do? Take
a cup of coffee.
Right.
We have longer term observational data.
Yeah. I appreciate what you said about the pharmacodynamics of it. That's something I hadn't considered. So in the presentation last night, you spoke a lot about high and low glycemic carbohydrates, and it seemed like you were comparing carbohydrates that would turn very quickly into glucose and be in the blood supply very quickly versus carbohydrates that would be very slow, and contrasting that rather than contrasting high carb and low carb, you're contrasting fast carb and slow carb. Is that a new tactic for low carb diets, to have slow carbs?
Well, really, we can think of carbohydrate in the diet as progressing along a spectrum. Mm-hmm. Why do we want to decrease carbohydrate? Well, to an extreme level, we can transition the body into a ketogenic state. But that requires really very meticulous carbohydrate restriction, as well as limitations on protein intake. There's evidence of benefit reducing carbohydrate before reaching that extreme state, and many people on low carbohydrate diets do not consistently run so-called therapeutic levels of ketones. So why would there be a benefit of reducing carbohydrate? Well, it could be that you blunt the surge of blood sugar after the meal, so you don't get the same burst of reactive oxygen species and chronic inflammation that occurs at that 1 hour point when your blood sugar is so high. The other possible advantage is lowering insulin levels. Mm-hmm. Too much of the hormone insulin can promote insulin resistance, can fuel the metabolic syndrome, and shifting simply from high to low glycemic index carbohydrates can accomplish those benefits to a considerable degree without having to eliminate many of the carbohydrates that people like to eat.
Right.
So it's really a question of degree of biological effect based on a person's baseline health status, their biological needs, the variation that occurs between people, and their health goals. Now, clearly, billions of people around the world have lived relatively healthful lives, eating quite a bit of carbohydrate.
Sure.
So why do we need to tell everybody to give up this, very tasty nutrient? And in fact, we don't have enough, animals to provide all of the protein and fat, that would be needed for approaching 10 billion people,
right.
To sustain themselves. But from a public health perspective, we can do a lot about the quality of the carbohydrate. And so simply shifting from the more processed to the minimally processed grains, when you think of global health, would have a massive effect.
Right.
We're talking about the difference between highly processed white flour that's quickly baked into bread with a 20-minute fermentation using industrial methods versus more traditional, like stone ground breads that are then slowly fermented. Right. So a lot of the sourdough, the classic sourdoughs, these heavy, dark, like German or Norwegian rye breads that you can actually see the kernel present. It's got big particle size. And with the long fermentation, a lot of the available rapidly digestible carbohydrate, including a lot of the gluten, can be digested.
Stripped out,
And then so what's left behind is much more resistant starch that has benefits in the colon, and fermentation product acids like lactic acid that itself has benefits, slows down digestion. So those kinds of more traditional grains, or if you don't want grains at all, there's no human requirement to consume grains, whole fruits, non-starchy vegetables, beans, again, depending upon your own particular philosophy about that. Beans are not big in the paleo group, but they're a great source of protein for people who want to, have a more, less animal-based approach to their diet. Sure. And, the latest research on aging suggests, fairly strongly suggests advantages, long-term advantages for more plant protein in slowing down the aging. The animal proteins seem to give you, the biggest immediate, metabolic bang, a little more musculature, potentially higher fertility.
Yes.
But some of these lower protein and more plant-based diets don't overactivate certain anabolic pathways, mTOR, for example, and, may look really good to slow down aging. So, we need flexibility of approach. There's no one approach to diet that's going to work for the entire world's populations. But I think, considering glycemic index as a first step for the global population, because it doesn't require giving up any class of foods. It just means that we'll process the foods differently and maybe shift agricultural policy, to favor some of the lower glycemic index, more traditional, sources of carbohydrate. And then for people who have a preference or a biological need, such as diabetes, then more significant restriction of carbohydrate up to and including a ketogenic diet.
Sure. So you said something interesting last night that you said there's no human requirement for carbohydrate. There's human requirement for protein and fat, but not for carbohydrate. But you said that it's almost impossible to be zero carbohydrate.
Yeah. Even if you're just eating animal products, muscle or liver organ meat contains some glycogen. That's the form of carbohydrate that's stored in animal bodies.
Right.
Not a lot of it, although, depending, I think some of the sea animals that maybe the Inuits would have eaten could have brought their carbohydrate intake up to maybe 10%.
Wow.
But depending upon exactly how much, muscle meat or organ meat. But clearly people can survive quite well without any specific minimum amount of carbohydrate. It's very difficult for, I think, anybody to get below about 20 grams a day.
Yeah.
I mean, you really, then you're talking about virtually eating no vegetables at all.
It is very difficult. I've done it.
Which people have done. I mean, the Inuits for most of the year would have maybe a little bit of sea vegetable that washed up on the shore, but, for most of the year would have been eating, very little. But that's really restrictive. And, there is much, I think, nutrition to be had in plant foods that provide antioxidants and anti-inflammatory chemicals. Although, again, there's debate about which plant foods and could there be downsides to some plant foods. After all, plants don't necessarily want us to eat them any more than animals want us to eat them. And certain parts of the plant, not the fruit, but other parts of the plant are infused oftentimes with chemicals designed to convince us not to eat them. So almonds, as they originally were present in nature, were laced with cyanide. They still contain very small amounts that don't, present a biological problem for us. But, some paleo folks don't eat beans because of concern for lectins. So, we need to be mindful. But, again, I think that, not ruling out any one class of foods for the entire world's population, to me, makes more sense. We aim for minimum deprivation for maximum benefits, which admittedly will vary from person to person.
Yeah, that's almost an economist statement. But another thing you mentioned last night was this fast response and then the roller coaster ride down and reactive hypoglycemia, and then you said you said earlier today that some of the ketogenic diets don't have this fast response, and possibly that it may be something that's needed. Could there be a downside to the fact that we don't have the glucose spike and we don't go through the range?
I think so. One question is, could there be a downside to the ketogenic diet?
That's a very good question.
And I don't see any problem from avoiding swings in blood sugar. I don't see any benefit. In fact, the body likes to have a steady access to metabolic fuels. The brain requires fuels 24/7, 365, and a brief interruption of fuels to the brain would be catastrophic.
Right.
And in fact, we have lots of regulatory systems that whose aim is to blunt the surge of glucose after a meal and prevent the crash that would occur later. The problem is our modern, highly processed, high carbohydrate diet push those regulatory systems beyond the breaking point, especially for some people who are insulin oversecretors. But there may be other downsides to ketogenic diet for some people.
Okay.
Well, one is it's highly restrictive.
Yeah.
So we live in a world surrounded by all sorts of tasty carbohydrates, and it requires meticulous commitment, and a brief foray from a strict ketogenic regimen can set you back quite a bit.
Yeah.
It shuts off, ketones can be shut off with one high carbohydrate meal, as you well know.
Yes, I do.
And, requires close monitoring, to get it right. And there's also the risks of some nutritional deficiencies. We don't yet know what the risks of kidney stones are, but there's some theoretical concerns that, with increased uric acid production and kidney stone formation. And then that brings us to the question of LDL cholesterol, because ketogenic diets are almost unavoidably very high in saturated fat, although one can play with that to a considerable degree.
Sure.
But saturated fat tends to be more ketogenic than unsaturated fats, and so they tend to go along well. And for some people, not for everybody, but some people, most people will experience some increase in their LDL, which is compensated for by an increase in commensurate increase in HDL and a decrease in their triglycerides.
Right.
But others experience an explosion of LDL, and that's not just these large, fluffy particles. I happen to be one of them.
Oh, really?
So I've been on a ketogenic diet. It's restrictive, but I love the mental clarity that I experience on it. But my LDL, my total cholesterol goes from a really healthful 160 or 180 to 280.
Right.
Most of that is LDL.
Yeah.
And I went from what NMR analysis suggested was a very low risk
Pattern A, yeah.
cardio profile
Yeah.
to a high risk cardio profile. Now, we don't know ultimately what the significance of high LDL and small particles for the subset of people who are like me
Sure.
might be to the heart in the context of low chronic inflammation, because my CRP is very low, and that's oftentimes the case on these diets.
Yeah.
But I disagree with some in the low-carb community to disregard LDL cholesterol. I think there's strong genetic evidence, including Mendelian randomization studies, that LDL is an independent predictor, an important independent predictor of cardiovascular disease risk. It's not the only one. And I think the mistake made by conventional medicine has been to exclusively focus on LDL, and in some cases causing other problems along the way, such as by decreasing saturated fat to very low levels and ignoring processed carbohydrate. So you lower LDL, but your triglycerides explode.
Triglycerides out, yeah.
But so we don't want to make that mistake, but there's a risk that the pendulum will swing too far in the other direction of entirely ignoring LDL for a subset of people who may actually be at significant risk.
Right. So did your triglycerides jump up when you went on a ketogenic diet?
No, my triglycerides have always been quite good. You know, I typically run a triglyceride to HDL ratio of near 1.
Nice.
Which is
under 2 is
ideal. Basically ideal.
Yeah.
And that didn't change very much. My triglycerides might have gone down just very slightly, but they've always been pretty low. The big change was the LDL.
Yeah. I was going to say that had your triglycerides gone up, you would have been the 7th person I've met in maybe 30,000 people I've spoken to who've done a low carb diet whose triglycerides went up. We've had people whose triglycerides went up from 150 to 1,000 on going on a ketogenic diet, and in all cases, I send them to their GP and say, you need to probably reconsider whether you're doing this, because we really don't know.
Well, I think what this emphasizes is that one size doesn't fit all.
Yeah,
there's this tendency in the world of nutrition to become religious.
Yes.
This has worked for me. I've found nutritional grail.
Yes.
And so it must work for everybody.
Right.
I mean, that's what religions do, you know?
It is.
It's unfortunate. It's contributing to the diet wars in both directions.
Yes.
You know, you have on the one hand vegans, and the other hand paleos or very low carbers. And both groups think the other is, pig-headed, refuses to embrace obvious data, and they question each other's motivations.
Right.
But they both may be right to a considerable degree for themselves.
Yeah.
Among, the 1,000 people who might have tried a vegan diet, maybe 100 do really well with it.
Right.
And that 100, has benefited. The problem is thinking that everybody will benefit from it. And the same is true on the other side with the low carb community.
Right.
Now, I think, as I've mentioned, I think that for type 2 diabetes, the evidence is quite strong favoring a low carb diet, although that could be plant based. I mean, there's no reason, and there's a whole growing, vital internet community of vegan ketos.
Right. I'd love to speak to some of them.
Yeah.
Because, and if any are listening, get in touch with me.
Well, I can introduce you to them.
I'd love to.
Some of them are my best friends.
Okay, good.
And conceptually it's appealing, but again, coming back to the main point, which is that, one size doesn't fit all.
Right.
We all need to be, showing a little more humility, that even though we may have found an approach that, works for us, it won't necessarily work for someone else, and that we have to consider ways that we could have, each of us have limited perspectives and would benefit by listening to our opponents.
Right.
That's true in politics in the United States. and elsewhere, it's true in the nutritional debates.
Yeah.
We need to depolarize a bit and recognize that there is tremendous inter-individual variation. Some of that is biologically determined.
Right. It brings to mind the Kempner rice diet, which
The which?
the Kempner diet from Duke in the 40s.
The
rice
rice
diet,
diet, yeah.
which was a
Yeah.
rice and white sugar
Yeah.
and fruit, and it was like all of the things that
Yeah.
you might think might derange a diabetic.
Yeah.
But Denise Minger did a presentation in Iceland about it, and she said, "I'm probably going to be stoned by this crowd because it was a low carb crowd." She said, "But," and then she
Yeah.
explained this, and it makes a funny kind of sense that if you really dial back on fats, there's like a back channel to the pancreas that will.
Well, I think what happens is on a conventional low-fat diet is that you're still eating enough fat so that the insulin, that's the high insulin produced by the carbohydrates, sends the message to store all the fats you're
Right,
eating. And
yeah.
at 20% fat,
Yeah.
there's still a lot of fat to store. If you get down below 10%,
Yeah.
which is doable,
Yeah.
it's very difficult,
Yeah.
but it's doable. You're still making a lot of insulin, and we don't know the long-term effects of that, but that insulin doesn't have a lot of fat to work on. And the process of de novo lipogenesis, so making fat from carbohydrate, which can occur, there's no doubt that occurs, but it's a sluggish pathway.
Okay.
And so, in that situation, especially for some people, they can succeed.
Right.
I have long-term concerns with that, but there are enough anecdotal reports, to suggest that, including reversing diabetes.
Yeah. It's not an experiment that I personally want to take on because I don't like the taste of white rice and fruit and sugar, but no, that's just at a personal level. I'd like to thank David Ludwig for sitting down with us on this lovely day in Sydney. And
My pleasure.
I hope that Australia looks after you.
Thank you.
Heard you say you're due for a little.
Well done, Richard.
Oh, thank you, Carl. I'm not a professional when it comes to interviewing. That's something that I generally leave to you. But since I was in country at the time, and Dr. Ludwig was a pro, he was able to give me interesting answers even if I asked stupid questions. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the slow carb thing. No
Yeah.
carbs is better than slow for a deranged metabolism like me. But it's interesting that he has his scope is a little bit wider than ours, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And it was interesting the comments that you made earlier about Italy. These are people who aren't deranged and they can probably tolerate slower carbs.
Right.
They're not eating processed food with a lot of sugar and processed flours and the like that we would eat. They don't eat Pop-Tarts in Italy. So, this is probably why, for them, that kind of, diet is entirely reasonable. They could probably thrive for the rest of their lives on it. For you and I, we're just so totally deranged that we really need something like keto to be safe.
But I got to tell you, there's no shortage of salty, fatty meats in Italy. And when they eat meat, it's full fat. Like they don't shy away from it like we do. So they've never had a low-fat diet.
I don't anymore. I do not shy away from the fat. I had pork belly tonight for dinner.
And, of course, we're all for more science being done, so we hope Dr. Ludwig gets the support he needs. Well, are you hungry?
Yeah, I kind of am. I think it's time
all
for
right,
some
then.
Recipes!
Recipes.
What you got, Carl?
Well, if you remember, last week I gave you the butter rum pie crust. Yeah, so I'm going to complete the cycle this week with pumpkin pie using the butter rum crust. Some pumpkin pie, most classic pumpkin pie recipes call for condensed milk or evaporated milk, which is, if you think about it, it's sweet and nasty, but it has the consistency of cream. It's actually even a little thicker than cream.
Yeah.
So mine, of course, doesn't use that.
Of course.
Mine is 1 15-ounce can of pure pumpkin puree.
Mm-hmm. You could actually cook your own pumpkin and steam it and puree it up. You don't have to get it out of a can.
You certainly could, and the true people. And by the way, Emmy, made Thanksgiving dinner for her family in Italy.
Nice.
And made a pumpkin pie.
Nice.
And there's no pumpkin in a can, so they have pumpkins. She did it all from scratch.
That's how I do
All
it
right.
too. Yeah, I don't eat pumpkin out of a can. But let's go with your recipe. Let's go.
All right, we'll go with that. So
Yeah.
as long as you have 15 ounces of pure pumpkin puree, you need a half a cup of heavy cream, 2 large eggs, 2/3 of a cup of Sirkin Gold brown sugar substitute,
Okay.
and you can use whatever you like there, but that's what I used. 2 teaspoons of pumpkin pie spice, and pumpkin spice, that's all the rage. It's easy to find.
So tell me about what pumpkin spice. What's in it?
Well, you got cloves, you got allspice, you got ginger, you got cinnamon,
Right.
nutmeg, that kind of stuff. It's that,
Yeah.
goes well with molasses kind of thing. It might not even have ginger in it, but I love ginger.
No, I think it does. Ginger powder, yeah.
Marianne was cute too, but I love ginger. Anyway,
Boom.
so you also need a half a teaspoon of kosher salt and a teaspoon of vanilla extract. So it's a very simple recipe. You make the butter rum pie crust from last week.
Sure.
You turn down the oven to 325, or, turn it up if it's off, but you want to set the oven to 325. If the crust has just come out of the oven, you let it cool for at least 15 minutes. Now you basically just combine all these ingredients with a whisk and pour it into the cooled pie shell and bake for 45 to 50 minutes or until it's almost set. You'll know when it's done. You'll see it. You'll jiggle it. It'll have a little wiggle to it, but not a lot of slop. And then it's done. And if you really want to, you can stick a straw in, or a piece of toothpick or something in the middle and see if it sticks. Yeah. But that's it.
Nice.
And I served it at Thanksgiving.
How was it?
It was great. I haven't had pumpkin pie since I started keto, so at least I don't think I have. Yeah. Well,
So
there you
this-
go. So what do you got, Richard?
So I'm also going to do a pie recipe, and this is going to be one that we had in Breckenridge, which was Brenda Zorn's pecan pie, or pecan
my
maple
God.
pie. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I'm not going to give a pie crust recipe, and Brenda actually got her recipe from Kim Dennis, and Kim put a post on our ketogenic forums in the recipes section.
Yeah.
And I'm going to link to that, and we're going to talk a little bit about this recipe. So I'm going to assume you've made the pie crust either from Kim's recipe or you've used Carl's recipe from last week.
Or something else.
Yeah, or something else. So what you're going to do is you're going to heat a pan, and you're going to melt about 100 grams of butter. And and you're going to add some Truvia. And Kim suggests 70 grams of Truvia, and which sounds really sweet, but she suggests, if you don't need it that sweet, cut the sugar by a third, and that's how Brenda does it. So I remember Brenda's was delicious. Yeah.
The way I make any dessert with any kind of artificial sweetener is I start with at least half of what the recipe calls for, and if that's fine, I leave it and add a little bit more until it's as sweet as you want.
Yeah. You're just trying to make it taste not wrong. So it's a sweet, so you want it to taste moderately sweet, so people think, oh, well, this is a pecan pie. But the majority of the flavor is going to be the butter and the pecans. So, so you've got melted butter in a pan, you've added the Truvia, and when it starts to bubble, you throw in the pecans and you stir it continually. And Brenda also suggests for maple, add about a teaspoon of maple extract and about 1/8 of a cup of 0-calorie maple syrup.
Nice.
And so she just pours the filling into the base and lets it set in the fridge. So this is not cooked. You start off with a cooked pie crust. And Brenda's actually has an option. She also melts 2 squares of dark chocolate and drizzles those over the top of the pie crust before she lets it to set. So it was delicious. It was really good. But it's just pecans and butter and a bit of sweetener. So it's nothing fancy, but it is delicious.
A little salt. That's just the perfect recipe right there. I remember ODing on that stuff. But, interestingly though, we, even though we ate a lot of rich food in Breckenridge last year, we didn't eat a lot of it.
Yeah. No, that's true. I had small morsels and I was done.
Yeah. And it's good and you move on.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about Breckenridge, we're going to do it again this year. So the interesting thing is that we are going to have another party house like we did last year at Low Carb Breckenridge. And we've got like 20 or 30 people. I'm going to smuggle in some beer from Australia. I think Louise is probably going to smuggle some zero carb beer in as well.
Yeah, right.
And we're going to be like cooking for the entire weekend. And this is where you go to taste Brenda's Pecan Pie.
That's right. So if you're around, look us up.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So
we're
doing it again this year.
Well, that's a show, man.
That is a show. Of course, if you have anything that you want to tell us, something we said wrong, something that you don't agree with, or some more research that you found to support or refute anything that we've said, send it by email to dudes@twoketodudes.com or post it on our website.
And you can follow us on Twitter at 2KetoDudes, on Instagram at 2KetoDudes, and make sure to use the hashtag 2KetoDudes.
And of course, if you want to join the free ketogenic forum, it's forum.2keto.com.
And if useless swag is your fancy, t-shirts, coffee mugs, and other junk with witty keto sayings on them, head over to gear.2keto.com.
And if you want a shot at getting that swag for free, join the 2 Keto Dudes fan club. You'll be eligible to win something in every show. Go to fanclub.2keto.com.
And if you feel like supporting our podcasts and our forums, think about making a pledge on our Patreon page at patreon.2keto.com.
Or just hit the donate button on our website at www.2ketodudes.com, or just go to donate.2keto.com.
You can also see all of our podcasts and other videos we've made on YouTube at youtube.2keto.com.
And if you haven't already, go leave us a review on iTunes. That's how new people get to know about what we do.
2 Keto Dudes is brought to you by 2 Keto LLC, who strives to support the low-carb community with podcasts and other publications. Well, keep calm and keto on, Richard.
Yeah, keep calm and keto on, Carl.
All right, and we'll see you next time on 2 Keto Dudes.